The gambling debt collector's shadow fell across Grace Dalton like a vulture's wing, and in that moment, standing in the dusty parlor of her father's ramshackle house outside Muskogee, Oklahoma Territory, she knew her life would never be the same. "Your father owes Mr. Landry $1,500, the man said, his voice carrying the flat indifference of someone who had delivered this kind of news 100 times before. "He cannot pay. Therefore, Mr. Landry has accepted an alternative arrangement." Grace felt her blood turn to ice water. Her father sat slumped in his chair by the cold fireplace, unable to meet her eyes. At 22 years old, she had spent the last 5 years trying to hold their small household together after her mother's death from consumption, working her fingers raw, taking in washing and mending while her father drank and gambled away every cent she earned. She had known this day might come, but the reality of it hit her like a physical blow. "What arrangement?" she asked, though part of her already knew. The debt collector pulled a folded document from his coat pocket. "You have been sold to settle the debt. A rancher named Ethan Cross purchased the contract this morning. He will be here within the hour to collect you." The words seemed to echo in the small room. Sold, like cattle, like property. Her hands began to tremble, and she pressed them against her worn calico skirt to still them. "That is not legal. You cannot sell a person." "The law sees it as an indenture contract," the man replied, unmoved by her protest. 7 years of service in exchange for the debt forgiveness. It is all proper and legal, Miss Dalton. Your father signed the papers." She turned to look at the broken man who had once taught her to ride, who had sung songs with her mother in the evenings, who had been reduced to this hollow shell by grief and weakness. "Papa!" He finally raised his head, and she saw tears streaking through the dust on his weathered face. "I am sorry, Gracie. I am so sorry. I had no choice. Landry would have killed me. So you sold me instead." The words came out flat, emotionless, because if she let herself feel anything in that moment, she would shatter into 1,000 pieces. Her father opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. What could he possibly say? The debt collector checked his pocket watch. "You have 30 minutes to gather your belongings. 1 trunk, no more." Grace walked to the small room that had been hers since childhood, moving as if in a dream. She owned so little that packing took only minutes. 2 dresses besides the one she wore, both faded and carefully mended. Her mother's hairbrush, the bristles worn soft. A small leather-bound book of poetry that had belonged to her grandmother. The quilt her mother had made for her 10th birthday. Undergarments, stockings with darned heels, a woolen shawl. She placed each item carefully in the battered trunk, her hands steady now, her mind oddly calm in the way that shock brings calm. When she emerged, the debt collector was still waiting, but her father had disappeared. She was not surprised. He had never been good at facing the consequences of his actions. The sound of hoofbeats outside drew her attention to the window. A man dismounted from a large bay horse, moving with the easy grace of someone who had spent most of his life in the saddle. He was tall, perhaps 30 years old, with dark hair that needed cutting and several days' worth of stubble on his jaw. He wore dusty range clothes, a worn leather vest over a blue cotton shirt, denim pants, scuffed boots with well-used spurs. A gun belt sat low on his hips, the holster tied down in the manner of someone who knew how to use it. This was Ethan Cross, then. The man who had bought her. He stepped into the house without knocking, his eyes adjusting to the dim interior. When his gaze found her, she lifted her chin and met it directly, refusing to cower. If she was to be sold like livestock, she would at least maintain her dignity. "Miss Dalton," he said, his voice a low rumble with traces of Texas in the vowels. "I am Ethan Cross. Are you ready?" "Do I have a choice?" she asked. Something flickered in his dark eyes, an expression she could not quite read. "No, I suppose you do not." The debt collector handed him the contract, and Ethan folded it into his vest pocket without reading it. He picked up her trunk as if it weighed nothing and headed back outside. Grace followed, not looking back at the house where she had spent her entire life. There was nothing there for her now. Ethan secured her trunk to a pack horse that had been trailing his bay. "Can you ride?" he asked. "Yes." He gestured to a dappled mare. "She is yours, then. It is a full day's ride to my ranch." Grace had expected to be thrown over a horse like a sack of grain, or at best made to ride double with him. The fact that he had brought a horse specifically for her caught her off guard. She gathered her skirts and mounted, settling into the saddle with practiced ease. Her mother had been an excellent horsewoman and had taught Grace before the illness took her. They rode out of the yard as the afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on the red Oklahoma dirt. Grace did not look back. The debt collector had already disappeared, no doubt off to ruin another life. For the first hour, they rode in silence. The landscape around Muskogee was a mix of rolling prairie and stands of oak and hickory, the grass turning golden in the late summer heat. Cicadas sang their shrill songs, and red-tailed hawks circled overhead, riding the thermals. Grace had always loved this land, even in its harshness. "We will stop to water the horses at Beaver Creek," Ethan said, breaking the silence. "Another 2 hours past that to the ranch." Grace nodded but did not reply. She was not going to make this easy for him by being friendly. He had bought her. Whatever his reasons, he had reduced her to property. But as the miles passed, she found herself studying him from the corner of her eye. He sat his horse well, relaxed but alert, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon. This was Indian territory, and while most of the tribes had been pushed onto reservations or further west, there were still dangers. Outlaws used the territory as a hiding place, knowing that law enforcement was scarce and often corrupt. When they reached Beaver Creek, Ethan dismounted and helped the horses drink, then filled his canteen from a clear pool upstream from where the animals waded. To Grace's surprise, he pulled a second canteen from his saddlebag and filled it as well, then brought it to her along with a cloth-wrapped bundle. "You must be hungry," he said, offering both. "It is not much, cornbread and some dried beef." She was hungry. She had been too shocked to eat breakfast, and it was now well past midday. Pride warred with practicality, and practicality won. She accepted the food and water with a brief nod of thanks. The cornbread was good, still slightly moist with a hint of honey. The dried beef was tough but flavorful. As she ate, Ethan walked a small distance away, giving her privacy, and rolled himself a cigarette. He stood with his back to her, smoking and watching the horizon with that same alert stillness. When she finished eating, Grace climbed down from her mare to stretch her legs and attend to personal necessities behind a stand of bushes. When she returned, Ethan was already mounted and waiting, the cigarette ground out beneath his boot heel. They rode on. The sun began its descent toward the western horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. Grace's body ached from hours in the saddle. She had ridden before, but not for such distances, and she knew she would be sore tomorrow. "Not much further," Ethan said, as if sensing her discomfort. "You can see the boundary of my land just past that rise." They crested a low hill, and Grace caught her first glimpse of the Cross Ranch. It was larger than she had expected, sprawling across a broad valley with a creek running through it. The main house was built of logs and stone, solid and well-maintained. There was a large barn, several outbuildings, corrals with horses, and in the distance, she could see cattle dotting the grassland. This was no small operation. As they approached, 2 men emerged from the barn. One was older, probably in his 60s, with iron-gray hair and a weathered face. The other was younger, perhaps Ethan's age, with sandy hair and a ready smile. "Boss," the older man said by way of greeting, then his eyes found grace and curiosity sparked in them. "Sam, Billy," Ethan acknowledged. "This is Miss Grace Dalton. She will be staying at the ranch. Grace, this is Sam Tucker, my foreman, and Billy Harris." Sam nodded respectfully. "Madam," Billy's smile widened. "Pleased to meet you, Miss Dalton." Ethan dismounted and moved to help Grace down, but she had already swung out of the saddle on her own. Her legs wobbled slightly when her feet hit the ground, stiff from the long ride, but she steadied herself. "Billy, see to the horses," Ethan directed. "Sam, can you bring Miss Dalton's trunk to the house?" "Sure thing, boss." Ethan gestured toward the house. "This way." Grace followed him up the wooden steps to a wide porch that wrapped around the front of the house. The door opened into a large main room with a stone fireplace taking up most of one wall. The furniture was simple but well made, masculine in its lack of decoration but clean and orderly. A bearskin rug lay before the hearth. Doorways led off to what she assumed were other rooms. "There are 3 bedrooms," Ethan said, moving through the space. "The largest is mine. The others are empty. You can choose whichever you prefer." He showed her the 2 rooms. One was slightly larger with a window facing east. The other was smaller but had windows on 2 walls, letting in more light. Both had simple rope beds with corn husk mattresses, a washstand, and a trunk for storage. "I will take this one," Grace said, choosing the smaller room. She did not want to take more than necessary from this man, even though he had already taken everything from her. Sam arrived with her trunk, setting it at the foot of the bed. He tipped his hat and left quickly, likely sensing the tension in the air. Ethan stood in the doorway, one hand resting on the frame. "The kitchen is through there," he said, gesturing. "There is a pump outside for water. The necessary is behind the house. I employ a woman from town, Mrs. Chen, who comes twice a week to help with heavier cleaning and laundry, but otherwise, I take care of my own needs and expect my men to do the same." Grace turned to face him fully. "What exactly do you expect from me, Mr. Cross?" He met her eyes steadily. "I expect you to make yourself at home." "I do not understand. You paid $1,500 for me. Surely you have some purpose in mind." Ethan reached into his vest pocket and pulled out the folded contract. Grace watched as he walked to the fireplace, struck a match against the stone, and set the paper alight. The contract curled and blackened, flames consuming the words that had bound her to 7 years of servitude. He held it until the fire nearly reached his fingers, then dropped the burning remnants onto the hearth where they crumbled to ash. Grace stared at the ashes, her mind struggling to comprehend what she had just witnessed. "Why would you do that?" "Because no person should be owned by another," Ethan said simply. "What your father did was legal, perhaps, but it was not right. You are free to go wherever you wish, Miss Dalton." "I will not stop you." The room seemed to tilt around her. "Free." After the terror and humiliation of the past few hours, after resigning herself to years of servitude, she was simply free. "I do not understand," she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why would you spend that money just to burn the contract?" Ethan was quiet for a moment, his dark eyes distant. "My mother was an indentured servant. She was sold by her family in Ireland to pay their passage to America. The man who bought her contract was not kind. By the time my father found her and bought her freedom, she had endured things no person should endure." His jaw tightened. "I swore I would never let such a thing happen if I had the power to prevent it." Grace sank onto the edge of the bed, her legs suddenly unable to hold her. The rush of emotions was overwhelming. Relief, confusion, gratitude, and beneath it all, a bone-deep exhaustion that came from fear finally releasing its grip. "I have nowhere to go," she admitted quietly. "No family besides my father, and I will not return there. No money, no prospects." "Then stay," Ethan said. "Not as a servant, but as a guest until you decide what you want to do. The ranch is large enough that we need not be in each other's way. When you are ready to leave, I will give you enough money to make a start somewhere new." It was too much, too generous, too incomprehensible after everything that had happened. "Why?" she asked again, knowing the question was inadequate but unable to articulate the depth of her confusion. "Because it is the right thing to do." He said it so matter-of-factly, as if decency was simply the natural order of things. Grace had known so little decency in recent years that she had almost forgotten what it looked like. "I will not be a burden," she said firmly. "If I am to stay, even temporarily, I will earn my keep. I can cook, clean, mend, tend a garden. I am not afraid of hard work." "That is not necessary." "It is necessary to me." They regarded each other across the small room, and something passed between them, an understanding perhaps. Ethan nodded slowly. "As you wish, but you are still free to leave at any time." He left her then, his footsteps echoing through the house before the front door closed behind him. Grace sat alone in the gathering dusk, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of her new surroundings, horses nickering in the corral, the low voices of the ranch hands settling in for the evening, a coyote's distant howl. She rose and unpacked her trunk, hanging her 2 spare dresses on pegs driven into the wall, setting her mother's hairbrush and grandmother's book on the washstand. The quilt she spread over the corn husk mattress, transforming the anonymous space into something that held a piece of her history. When she finally lay down to sleep, still wearing her dress because she had no nightgown, exhaustion claimed her quickly. But her last waking thought was of Ethan Cross's hands holding the burning contract, and the quiet conviction in his voice when he said it was the right thing to do. She woke to sunlight streaming through the windows and the smell of coffee. For a moment, she was disoriented, expecting to see the familiar walls of her childhood room. Then memory returned, and with it, the strange reality of her new situation. Grace rose, washed her face in the basin, and brushed her hair until it gleamed, pinning it into a neat bun at the nape of her neck. She smoothed her dress, wishing she had something less worn to wear, and ventured out into the main room. Ethan stood at the stove, poking at something in a cast-iron pan. The smell of frying bacon joined the coffee aroma. He looked up when she entered, and something that might have been relief crossed his features. "I was not sure you would still be here," he admitted. "Where would I go?" She asked, then added more softly, "Good morning." "Good morning. Are you hungry?" "Yes." He gestured to a chair at the rough-hewn table. "Sit. It is almost ready." Grace watched as he dished up bacon, fried eggs, and thick slices of bread onto 2 tin plates. The portions were generous, more food than she usually ate in a day back home. When he set the plate before her and took the seat across from her, she bowed her head briefly in silent thanks before picking up her fork. They ate in silence for a few minutes. The food was simple but good, the eggs cooked just right, the bacon crispy. Finally, Grace set down her fork and looked at him directly. "I meant what I said last night. I will not live here as a charity case. Put me to work." Ethan took a sip of his coffee, considering. "Can you really cook?" "Better than this," she said, then immediately regretted the words. "I apologize. That was unkind. The food is good." To her surprise, he laughed, a deep, genuine sound that transformed his serious features. "No, you are right. I can manage not to starve, but I am no cook. If you truly want to help, I would be grateful for decent meals. Consider it done. What else? The garden has been neglected. I started one in the spring, but I have not had time to maintain it properly. There is laundry, mending, the usual household tasks. Mrs. Chen is competent, but having someone here regularly would make a difference. Grace nodded. Show me everything. I will start today. After breakfast, Ethan gave her a tour of the ranch buildings. The garden was indeed neglected, choked with weeds, but she could see that the soil was good and the location well chosen. Tomatoes struggled on broken stakes. Beans tangled in wild profusion. Squash plants sprawled everywhere. With work, it could be salvaged. The hen house held a dozen chickens and a rooster. Fresh eggs daily, Ethan noted. Though the hens hide them sometimes, you have to search. The root cellar was well stocked with preserved goods, flour, cornmeal, sugar, coffee, dried beans, and other staples. I make a supply run to Muskogee once a month, he explained. More often if needed. Back at the house, he showed her the linen closet with its meager supply of worn towels and bedding, the washroom with its large copper tub and scrubbing board, the pantry with its shelves waiting to be filled with preserves and pickles, and all the abundance of harvest season. I leave the running of the house entirely to your judgment, Ethan said. Use whatever you need. The ranch account at the general store in Muskogee is in good standing. If you need supplies, make a list and I will get them, or you can come along on the next trip. I will make a list, Grace said. The thought of returning to Muskogee, of possibly encountering her father or anyone who knew what had happened, made her stomach clench. Ethan seemed to understand. He nodded and headed for the door. I will be working with the horses today if you need anything. Sam and Billy will be out checking fence lines. Left alone, Grace rolled up her sleeves and got to work. She started with the breakfast dishes, heating water and scrubbing everything clean. Then she swept the entire house, shaking out rugs, wiping down surfaces, opening windows to let fresh air chase away the accumulated staleness of a house kept by men alone. In the heat of midday, she tackled the garden, pulling weeds until her hands were dirty and her back ached. She staked the tomatoes properly, thinned the beans, and made note of what could be harvested. The physical labor felt good, honest, grounding after the emotional turmoil of the past day. When she went to the hen house to collect eggs, she found herself talking to the chickens, grateful for their simple presence. They clucked and pecked, unconcerned with human drama, and she gathered 8 eggs, warm and perfect. For supper, Grace made her mother's receipt for chicken and dumplings, rich and savory, the kind of food that stuck to the ribs and satisfied deep hunger. She baked biscuits in the Dutch oven, golden and fluffy. When Ethan came in at dusk, dirty and tired from a day of hard work, he stopped in the doorway and simply stared at the table she had set. It smells incredible, he said. Wash up, Grace replied, feeling a small surge of pride. It is ready. Sam and Billy had gone to the bunkhouse for their own supper, so it was just the two of them again. Ethan bowed his head for a longer grace than Grace had offered at breakfast, thanking God for the food, the day, and for safe travels. When he said amen and took his first bite, his eyes closed briefly in appreciation. This is the best meal I have had in years, he said. It is just chicken and dumplings. It is a gift, thank you. They fell into an easy conversation as they ate. Ethan told her about the ranch, how he had started with nothing 5 years ago and built it up slowly, adding land and cattle and horses. He specialized in breeding and training horses, selling them to the army and to ranchers who needed good working stock. The cattle are secondary, he explained. Enough to keep us fed and provide some additional income, but horses are my passion. A good horse can mean the difference between life and death out here. Grace told him about her life before yesterday, carefully editing out the worst parts, her mother's death, the struggle to keep the household running, her father's slow descent into gambling and drink. She spoke of her love for books, her skill with a needle, her mother's garden that had once been the envy of their neighbors. "You must miss her terribly," Ethan said quietly. "Every day. She was the strong one. When she died, everything fell apart. It was not your fault." Grace looked up, surprised by the intensity in his voice. "I know that intellectually, but in my heart I always wonder if I could have done more." "You did more than most would have. You stayed. You tried. That takes strength." His words settled something in her chest. A knot she had not even known was there loosening slightly. They finished the meal talking of smaller things, easier things, and when Grace rose to clear the dishes, Ethan helped without being asked, the two of them working side by side in companionable silence. The days began to establish a rhythm. Grace rose early to make breakfast, pack lunches for the men working the far pastures, tend the garden, care for the chickens, do the endless round of household chores. She baked bread twice a week, filling the house with its yeasty fragrance. She mended clothes, darned socks, scrubbed floors, beat rugs. She harvested vegetables and began putting up preserves, the pantry shelves slowly filling with jars of tomatoes, beans, pickles, jam made from wild blackberries she found growing along the creek. Ethan worked from dawn until dusk, training horses, managing his small herd of cattle, maintaining the buildings and fences, doing all the 1,000 tasks that kept a ranch running. But every evening he came to the house for supper, and they would sit together and talk. Sometimes about their days, sometimes about their pasts, sometimes about books they had read or places they hoped to see. Grace found herself looking forward to those evening conversations more than she wanted to admit. Ethan was intelligent, well-read despite his lack of formal education, thoughtful in his opinions. He listened when she spoke, really listened, asking questions that showed he valued her thoughts. It was so different from her father's dismissive attitude, from the way most men in Muskogee had treated her as if her only value lay in her appearance and her domestic skills. One evening, about 2 weeks after her arrival, Ethan came in with a package wrapped in brown paper. "I was in town today for supplies," he said, setting it on the table in front of her. "This is for you." Grace unwrapped it carefully and her breath caught. Inside was fabric, yards of it, a soft blue cotton suitable for a dress, white muslin for undergarments, thread, needles, buttons. Everything she would need. "You needed new clothes," Ethan said, sounding almost defensive. "What you have is nearly worn through." She ran her hand over the fabric, touched beyond words. "This is too much. It is practical. You work hard. You should have proper clothing." "Thank you," she managed, her throat tight with emotion. "There is more," he said, pulling a book from his coat pocket. "I remembered you said you liked poetry." It was a volume of Wordsworth, the binding still stiff and new. Grace opened it carefully, seeing her grandmother's name written in faded ink on the flyleaf. No, not her grandmother's book. This was a new copy, just purchased, but the same edition. "How did you know?" she whispered. "You mentioned it was your grandmother's favorite." "The shopkeeper in Muskogee found a copy for me." Grace looked up at him. This man who had bought her freedom and asked nothing in return, who treated her with unfailing respect, who paid attention to the small things she said and remembered them. Something shifted in her chest, a feeling she was not quite ready to name. "You are very kind," she said. "I am only doing what anyone should do." But they both knew that was not true. Most men would not have burned the contract. Most men would have demanded the service they had paid for. Most men would not have given her gifts for no reason other than simple thoughtfulness. Grace spent the next few evenings cutting and sewing the blue fabric into a new dress. Her stitches were small and even, the product of years of practice. When she finally put it on, the transformation was remarkable. The color brought out the blue in her eyes, and the fit was perfect because she had made it for herself. She had not felt pretty in so long that seeing herself in the small mirror in her room was almost startling. When she emerged for breakfast wearing the new dress, Ethan's reaction was immediate and gratifying. His eyes widened slightly and he said, "You look beautiful." Grace felt heat rise in her cheeks. Thank you for the fabric. It was my pleasure." Something was changing between them, subtle but undeniable. Glances held a moment longer than necessary. Hands brushing when passing a plate at supper. An awareness that made the air feel charged with possibility. One Sunday, Ethan asked if she would like to go riding with him, just for pleasure rather than purpose. They saddled the horses and rode out into the Oklahoma countryside, following the creek into the hills beyond the ranch. The late summer day was beautiful, the heat broken by a thunderstorm the night before, the air washed clean and smelling of earth and grass. They rode side by side, not talking much, simply enjoying the movement and the landscape and each other's company. When they reached a high point that overlooked the valley, Ethan dismounted and helped Grace down, his hands firm on her waist. "I love this land," he said, gazing out over the rolling prairie. "When I first came here, I had nothing, just a horse and a saddle and the clothes on my back. But I worked and I saved and I built something. This ranch is mine, truly mine, and no one can take it away." "It must have been hard," Grace said. "It was, but it was worth it. Freedom is always worth fighting for." She understood then that his actions were not just about her, or even about his mother. They were about a deeply held belief that every person deserved the chance to build their own life, to be beholden to no one, to stand on their own ground and call it home. "I think I am beginning to understand you, Ethan Cross," she said softly. He turned to look at her, and the expression in his eyes made her heart beat faster. "I hope so, Grace Dalton." They stood there on the hilltop, the wind tugging at their clothes, and Grace felt something inside her shift and settle into place. She was falling in love with this man. It was terrifying and exhilarating and completely unexpected. The ride back was quieter, both of them lost in their own thoughts. When they reached the ranch and Ethan helped her dismount, his hands lingered on her waist and she looked up at him, seeing her own feelings reflected in his eyes. "Grace," he said, his voice rough. "Yes." "I need to tell you something." She waited, her heart hammering. "When I heard about your situation, when I learned what your father had done, I was furious. I went to that auction intending to buy your contract and burn it, to set you free and send you on your way with enough money to start over. That was all I meant to do. And now," she prompted when he paused, "now I find myself hoping you will stay, not out of obligation or gratitude, but because you want to, because you might feel even a fraction of what I am beginning to feel for you." Grace's breath caught. "What are you feeling?" "Like I've been waiting my whole life for you to walk through my door. Like every meal we share and every conversation we have is a gift. Like I am falling in love with you, and I have no right to because you came here under such terrible circumstances, and you probably see me as your jailer even though I burned the contract." "You are not my jailer," Grace said firmly. "You are the man who gave me back my freedom. You are the man who treats me with respect and kindness. You are the man who remembered that I love Wordsworth and bought me a book just to see me smile." "Grace." She stepped closer, closing the distance between them. "I am falling in love with you too, Ethan. I did not expect to. I did not think I could after everything that happened. But you have shown me what it means to be truly valued, and I cannot help but love you for it." His hand came up to cup her cheek, his thumb brushing across her cheekbone with infinite gentleness. "I want to court you properly. I want to do this right." "Then court me," she said, smiling up at him. He leaned down slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, and pressed his lips to hers in a kiss that was soft and sweet and full of promise. Grace felt it all the way to her toes, a warmth that spread through her entire body. When they finally pulled apart, both of them were smiling. "I am going to marry you, Grace Dalton," Ethan said, "if you will have me. Ask me again in a few months after this courtship you promised me," she replied, her eyes sparkling with happiness. "I want to be courted properly." True to his word, Ethan courted her with a dedication that would have been almost comical if it had not been so deeply touching. He brought her wildflowers from the prairie. He read poetry with her in the evenings, the two of them sitting close on the porch as the sun set. He took her on rides through the countryside, showing her every corner of his land. He asked her opinions on ranch matters and listened seriously to her suggestions. In late September, he took her to Muskogee for the harvest dance. Grace had been nervous about returning to town, but Ethan stayed close to her side, his hand protective at the small of her back. She saw her father across the room at one point, haggard and hollow-eyed, and felt only pity. He had made his choices, and she had made hers. When Ethan led her onto the dance floor, she felt the eyes of the town on them, curious and speculative. She did not care. She let him guide her through the waltz, her hand in his, and she felt safe and cherished in a way she never had before. "People are talking," she murmured. "Let them talk," Ethan replied. "I am dancing with the woman I love. That is all that matters." On the ride home under a sky full of stars, Ethan pulled the wagon to a stop and turned to face her. "I said I would wait a few months before asking again. It has been 2. I cannot wait any longer. Grace Dalton, will you marry me?" She did not hesitate. "Yes. Yes, I will marry you, Ethan Cross." He kissed her there in the wagon, under the stars, and Grace felt a joy so complete it almost frightened her. She had gone from the lowest point of her life to this perfect moment in the span of 2 months, and it felt like a dream. They were married in late October at the small church in Muskogee, with Sam and Billy as witnesses and a handful of friends from town in attendance. Grace wore a dress she had sewn herself from cream-colored silk that Ethan had insisted on buying, with lace at the collar and cuffs. She carried a bouquet of the last wildflowers of the season. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife and Ethan kissed her, Grace felt tears of happiness sliding down her cheeks. This man, this good and honorable man, was her husband. She was no longer Grace Dalton, property of no one. She was Grace Cross, beloved wife, equal partner, free woman. The wedding supper was held at the ranch, with Sam and Billy and Mrs. Chen, and several neighbors joining them for a feast Grace and Ethan had prepared together. There was roasted beef, potatoes, fresh bread, preserved vegetables, pies made from the last of the summer berries. There was music and dancing and laughter. When the guests finally left and Grace and Ethan were alone in the house that was now truly theirs together, he carried her over the threshold of the bedroom with a solemnity that made her laugh. "What?" he asked, setting her gently on her feet. "You are so serious about everything." "This is serious. You are my wife. I have been waiting for this moment." Grace reached up and began unpinning her hair, letting it fall in waves around her shoulders. She saw Ethan's eyes darken with desire, and she felt an answering heat in her own body. "Then stop talking and kiss me, husband." He did, and the kiss quickly deepened into something that set them both on fire. They came together with a passion that surprised Grace in its intensity, the careful restraint of their courtship falling away to reveal the depth of their need for each other. Ethan was gentle with her, careful of her inexperience, whispering words of love against her skin as he showed her the heights of physical intimacy. Afterward, lying in his arms, Grace felt a contentment so profound it brought fresh tears to her eyes. "What is wrong?" Ethan asked, concern in his voice. "Nothing is wrong. Everything is right. I am just so happy I can hardly believe it is real." He tightened his arms around her. "It is real. You are mine and I am yours, and nothing will ever separate us." Grace believed him. The winter months passed in a blur of domestic contentment. Grace threw herself into making the house a true home, sewing curtains and quilts, cooking meals that filled the house with warmth and good smells, organizing and improving every corner. Ethan worked the ranch, preparing for spring, training horses even in the cold weather. In the evenings, they sat by the fire, reading aloud to each other or simply talking about everything and nothing. Sometimes they played cards or checkers. Sometimes Ethan played the harmonica he had learned as a boy, and Grace sang along, her voice sweet and true. They made love often, learning each other's bodies, discovering what brought pleasure, growing more comfortable and adventurous. Grace had never imagined that marriage could be like this partnership of equals, this combination of friendship and passion and deep respect. In January, she began to suspect she might be pregnant. By February, she was certain. When she told Ethan, he picked her up and spun her around, laughing with pure joy. "A baby," he kept saying. "We are going to have a baby." "Are you happy?" Grace asked, though his reaction made the question unnecessary. "Happy does not begin to cover it. You have given me everything, Grace." Everything I ever wanted. The pregnancy progressed smoothly. Grace continued her work around the house, slowing down only as her belly grew large and unwieldy. Ethan became almost comically protective, trying to forbid her from doing anything more strenuous than sitting in a chair. But Grace laughed and ignored him, knowing that she was strong and healthy and perfectly capable of managing normal tasks. In late September, exactly a year after Ethan had proposed, Grace went into labor. Mrs. Chen came to attend her, along with the doctor from Muskogee. The labor was long and difficult, lasting through the night and into the next day. Ethan paced outside the bedroom door, nearly frantic with worry, while Sam and Billy tried to distract him with card games and conversation. Finally, as the sun began to set on the second day, the thin, furious wail of a newborn baby echoed through the house. The doctor emerged a few minutes later, tired but smiling. "You have a son, Mr. Cross, a healthy boy, and your wife did magnificently. She is tired but well." Ethan rushed into the room to find Grace propped up against the pillows, exhausted and sweaty and glowing with happiness. In her arms was a tiny bundle wrapped in the quilt her mother had made. When Ethan approached, Grace drew back the edge of the quilt to reveal a red-faced infant with a shock of dark hair. "Meet your son," Grace said softly. Ethan reached out with trembling hands and took the baby, cradling him with a gentleness that belied his size. "He is perfect," he breathed. "Grace, he is absolutely perfect." "What should we name him?" she asked. They had discussed names during the pregnancy, unable to agree on any of them. But looking at his son's face, Ethan knew immediately. "James, for my father, James Cross." "James," Grace repeated, tasting the name. "Yes, that is perfect." Ethan sat on the edge of the bed, and together they looked down at their son, this new life they had created, this promise of the future. Grace leaned her head on Ethan's shoulder, and he wrapped his free arm around her, holding his whole world in his embrace. "I love you," he said. "I love you both so much." "We love you too," Grace replied. The first years of James's life were busy and full. Grace devoted herself to motherhood with the same dedication she brought to everything, while still managing the household and helping with the ranch. Ethan expanded the operation, buying more land, increasing the size of his horse herd. Sam and Billy became like uncles to James, teaching him to ride almost before he could walk, filling his head with stories of the old days. When James was 3, Grace discovered she was pregnant again. This time, the pregnancy was harder and she was often sick and tired. But when she gave birth to a daughter in the spring, all the difficulties were forgotten. "What should we name her?" Ethan asked, holding his daughter with the same wonder he had shown when James was born. Grace thought of her mother, the strong woman who had shaped so much of who she was. "Elizabeth, after my mother." "Elizabeth Cross," Ethan said. "It is beautiful." Elizabeth was a serious baby, watchful and quiet where James had been boisterous. As she grew, it became clear she had inherited her mother's intelligence and her father's determination, a formidable combination. The years passed in the way they do when life is full and happy. James grew tall and strong, passionate about horses like his father. Elizabeth became an avid reader, devouring every book she could get her hands on, and showed a talent for numbers that Ethan put to use managing the ranch accounts as she got older. Grace and Ethan's love deepened and matured, the passionate romance of their early days settling into something even more profound. They were partners in every sense, working together to build not just a ranch but a legacy for their children. In the evenings, when the work was done and the children were in bed, they still sat together on the porch, watching the sun set over the prairie. Sometimes they talked. Sometimes they simply sat in comfortable silence, hands linked, grateful for everything they had built together. "Do you ever think about that day?" Grace asked one evening when James was 10 and Elizabeth 7. "The day you bought my contract." "Often," Ethan admitted. "It was the best $1,500 I ever spent." Grace turned to look at him, seeing the gray threading through his dark hair, the lines around his eyes from squinting into the sun, the face she loved more than any other. "You saved my life that day." "No," Ethan said, pulling her close. "We saved each other. You gave me a home, a family, a purpose beyond just surviving. You made my life worth living." "I love you, Ethan Cross." "I love you, Grace Cross." They kissed as the sun painted the sky in shades of orange and gold, the same colors that had blazed the first evening she had ridden onto this land. Then, she had been frightened and alone, sold like property, her future a terrifying blank. Now, she sat beside the man she loved, secure in the knowledge that she was cherished and valued and free. When they finally went inside, James and Elizabeth were supposed to be asleep, but were actually playing quietly in James's room. Grace heard their whispered laughter and smiled, remembering her own childhood, the games she had played with imaginary friends in the lonely years after her mother died. Her children would never know that loneliness. They would grow up surrounded by love, secure in their place in the world, free to become whoever they wanted to be. It was the greatest gift she could give them. The ranch continued to prosper as the years went by. Ethan's reputation for breeding and training excellent horses spread, and buyers came from as far away as Texas and Kansas. The cattle herd grew as well, and they hired more hands to help manage the increased workload. Grace maintained a large garden, preserving enough food to last through the winters with plenty left over to share with neighbors. She became known in the area for her generosity, always ready to help a family in need with food or advice or, simply, a sympathetic ear. When James turned 18, Ethan gave him a piece of the ranch to manage on his own, teaching him the business side of ranching along with the practical skills. James thrived under the responsibility, showing the same work ethic and integrity that had built the Cross Ranch into one of the most successful operations in the territory. Elizabeth, at 15, announced that she wanted to become a teacher. Grace and Ethan supported her ambition wholeheartedly, arranging for her to attend the normal school in a nearby town. It was hard to let her go, but they knew it was important to let their children follow their own paths. One autumn evening, when Ethan and Grace had been married for nearly 20 years, they sat on the porch watching the sunset as they had done thousands of times before. They were in their 50s now, their hair gray, their bodies marked by years of hard work, but the love between them had not diminished. "You have any regrets?" Grace asked, a question she had never asked before. Ethan considered it seriously, as he considered all her questions. "I regret that your father's actions brought you such pain. I regret that your mother did not live to see the woman you became, the family we built, but I do not regret a single day of our life together." "Neither do I," Grace said. "Even the hard parts, even the losses." They had buried friends over the years, including Sam Tucker just the previous winter. They had weathered droughts and harsh winters and all the challenges that came with ranching in Oklahoma territory, but they had weathered them together. "We have been blessed," Ethan said simply. "We have made our own blessings," Grace replied, "with hard work and love and determination." He smiled at her, that same smile that had melted her heart all those years ago. "You are right. We have made our own blessings." James married at 21, choosing a sensible young woman from a neighboring ranch who shared his love of horses. The wedding was a joyous occasion, held at the Cross Ranch with half the county in attendance. Grace watched her son dance with his bride and remembered her own wedding, the joy and hope of that day. Elizabeth graduated from normal school and took a position teaching in Muskogee. She boarded with Mrs. Chen, who was now elderly but still sharp as a tack. Every Sunday, Elizabeth came home for dinner, filling the house with stories of her students and her growing passion for education. When James and his wife welcomed their first child, making Ethan and Grace grandparents for the first time, it felt like the completion of a circle. Grace held her grandson and thought about the baby she had been carrying when she had stood in her father's house, listening to the debt collector explain that she had been sold. That baby had never existed except in her imagination, but this one was real, warm, and solid in her arms, proof of everything she and Ethan had built. As the years continued to pass, Grace sometimes thought about her father. She had learned through town gossip that he had died a few years after selling her, his liver destroyed by drink. She had felt a distant sadness at the news but no real grief. He had made his choices, and she had made hers, and her choices had led to this beautiful life. On their 25th wedding anniversary, Ethan surprised Grace with a trip to St. Louis. It was the first time either of them had traveled beyond Oklahoma and neighboring states, and the city amazed them with its size and noise and endless activity. They stayed in a hotel with running water and electric lights, luxuries that seemed almost decadent after their simple ranch life. But the best part of the trip was simply being together, exploring this new place hand in hand, marveling at everything they saw. On their last evening, Ethan took her to a fine restaurant where they ate food they could not even pronounce and drank wine from crystal glasses. "Thank you for this," Grace said, looking across the candlelit table at her husband. "It has been wonderful." "You deserve wonderful things," Ethan replied. "You have given me a wonderful life. We have given each other a wonderful life." They returned to the ranch renewed and grateful, appreciating their home in a new way after seeing the wider world. The prairie had never looked more beautiful, the house never more welcoming. Elizabeth married at 26, choosing a lawyer from Muskogee who respected her intelligence and supported her teaching career. It was a modern marriage in many ways, a partnership of equals that reminded Grace of her own relationship with Ethan. James and his wife had 3 children eventually, filling the ranch with noise and laughter. Elizabeth and her husband had 2, including a daughter they named Grace, which made the original Grace cry with happiness. As Ethan and Grace moved into their 60s, they gradually turned over more of the ranch operations to James while still remaining involved in the decisions. Grace's garden was as productive as ever, though she now had help from James's wife and the older grandchildren. The house was always full of family, especially on Sundays and holidays when everyone gathered for enormous meals and loud, happy conversations. One summer evening, when they had been married for 35 years, Grace and Ethan sat on the porch watching their grandchildren play in the yard. The air was warm and sweet with the scent of honeysuckle, and lightning bugs were just beginning to emerge as dusk settled over the prairie. "Can you believe we made all of this?" Grace asked, gesturing to the children, the prosperous ranch, the life they had built. "Sometimes it still feels like a dream," Ethan admitted. "I see you sitting there, and I remember the first time I saw you, standing in your father's house with your chin up and fire in your eyes, refusing to be broken by what had happened to you. I fell in love with you in that moment, though I did not realize it until later." "I fell in love with you when you burned the contract," Grace said. "I knew then that you were different from any man I had ever known. I would do it again in a heartbeat, 1,000 times over." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the children play until James called them in for supper. The whole family ate together that evening, 3 generations around the big table Ethan had built when James was born, passing bowls of food and telling stories and laughing. After supper, the older grandchildren begged Ethan to tell them stories of the old days, when Oklahoma was still called Indian Territory, when outlaws and lawmen and settlers all vied for control of the land. He obliged, spinning tales of close calls and hard winters, and the endless work of building the ranch from nothing. Grace listened, adding her own memories, and she marveled at how their story had become family history, how the frightened young woman and the cowboy who freed her had become the foundation of this thriving family. That night, lying in bed beside Ethan, Grace said, "I want you to know that you gave me the greatest gift anyone has ever given me." "What was that?" Ethan asked, pulling her close. "A choice. When you burned that contract, you gave me the choice of what to do with my life. I chose you, and I chose this life, and I have never regretted it for a single moment." "I chose you too," Ethan said. "The moment I heard what your father had done, I chose to help you, and then I chose to love you, and I have spent every day since choosing you again and again." They fell asleep in each other's arms as they had done for 35 years, and Grace's last waking thought was one of profound gratitude. The seasons continued their eternal cycle. Spring brought new foals and calves, the garden bursting to life, the prairie covered in wildflowers. Summer brought heat and hard work and long days. Autumn brought harvest and cooler weather and the preparations for winter. Winter brought cold and quiet and the chance to rest before the cycle began again. Through it all, Grace and Ethan grew older together, their love deepening with each passing year. They attended the weddings of their grandchildren, welcomed great-grandchildren into the world, said goodbye to friends and neighbors who passed on. When Ethan turned 70, his health began to decline. He had worked hard all his life, and his body was simply wearing out. Grace watched with a breaking heart as the strong, vital man she loved struggled with tasks that had once been easy. But he never complained, and he never lost his sense of humor or his love for her. On a warm spring morning, when the prairie was covered in new grass, and the birds were singing, and everything was coming back to life, Ethan died peacefully in his sleep with Grace beside him. She woke to find him gone, his face peaceful, his hand still holding hers. The grief was crushing, but Grace bore it as she had borne every other challenge in her life, with dignity and strength. The funeral was attended by hundreds of people whose lives Ethan had touched over the years. James spoke about his father's integrity and work ethic. Elizabeth spoke about his support for her education and his pride in her accomplishments. Friends and neighbors shared stories of his generosity and fairness. But it was Grace who spoke last, standing at the graveside with her children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren surrounding her. "Ethan Cross was the best man I ever knew," she said, her voice strong despite her tears. "He gave me back my freedom when I had lost it, and then he gave me his heart. He built this ranch with his hands and his sweat, but more importantly, he built a family on a foundation of love and respect and unwavering integrity. He taught us all what it means to live honorably. He will be missed more than words can express, but his legacy will live on in every one of us." They buried him on a hill overlooking the ranch with a simple headstone that read, "Ethan Cross, beloved husband, father, and grandfather." Grace lived for another 5 years after Ethan's death, staying in the house they had shared, tending her garden, surrounded by family. She saw 2 more great-grandchildren born, attended another grandchild's wedding, continued to be the heart of the family even as her own health slowly failed. On a golden autumn afternoon, when the prairie was painted in shades of amber and rust, Grace passed away quietly in her sleep. She was 81 years old. Her children found her in the morning, lying peacefully in the bed she had shared with Ethan, a slight smile on her face, the Wordsworth book he had given her all those years ago open on the bedside table. They buried her beside Ethan on the hill, her headstone matching his, Grace Cross, beloved wife, mother, and grandmother. At the funeral, James spoke of his mother's strength and resilience. Elizabeth spoke of her kindness and wisdom. The grandchildren and great-grandchildren shared memories of her laughter, her stories, her unconditional love. But it was young Grace, Elizabeth's daughter, now a woman of 25, who perhaps understood best what her grandmother's life had meant. She stood beside the grave and told the story of how Grace Dalton had been sold to pay her father's debts, and how Ethan Cross had bought her and burned the contract, and how that single act of decency had been the beginning of everything this family had become. "My grandmother taught me that we are not defined by what happens to us, but by how we respond," young Grace said. She was sold like property, but she refused to let that define her. She chose to see possibility instead of victimhood. She chose love over bitterness. She chose to build instead of destroy. And because of those choices, all of us are here today. The Cross Ranch continued to thrive, passed down through the generations, each one adding to the legacy Ethan and Grace had begun. The story of the cowboy who burned the contract and the woman who chose to stay became family legend, told and retold around dinner tables and on front porches, a reminder of where they had come from and the values that defined them. And if you went to that hill overlooking the prairie, you would find 2 headstones side by side, weathered now by decades of wind and rain and sun, but still standing, still together. Ethan and Grace Cross, who had found each other in the worst of circumstances and built something beautiful that would last for generations. Their love story had started with an act of compassion, grown through mutual respect and deep friendship, and blossomed into a passion that sustained them through all the challenges life brought. They had worked side by side, loved completely, raised their children with wisdom and care, and left behind a legacy that would endure long after they were gone. In the end, Theirs was a story of freedom and choice, of seeing the humanity in another person and acting accordingly, of building a life on a foundation of love and integrity. It was a story worth telling, worth remembering, worth passing down through the years as an example of what was possible when two people chose each other, every single day, through all the seasons of a long and beautiful life together. The prairie wind still blows across that hill, whispering through the grass that grows over their graves, carrying with it the echo of their story, a testament to the enduring power of love and the freedom to choose that love, freely given and freely received, world without end.